back in the early 90s, frames were kind of considered diminishing returns. If you made a special aerodynamic frame, sure there were some small gains to be made, but really the posture was a much more important equation. And so Jim set about setting the perfect geometry and would weld up these custom frames. And as that had sort of gravitated, as we reached a point where frame geometry became more stabilized, then we started looking at, well, how do you make the bike faster? And overall, a rider on a road bike is going to have 3,000 to 3,500 grams of drag. A great aerodynamic road frame is going to have 500 to 600 grams of drag. So we're not talking about, changing cycling to a point where riders are going to start somehow getting, traveling at speeds that we're not seeing currently today. The gains to be had, though, are certainly the differences between winning and losing at the top stage. It's not something that we just sort of turned a new page in our chapter and decided to start building aerodynamic road bikes. In 2004, Jim was involved with the US Olympic team in their debut in triathlon, and so we started looking at building ITU bikes, road racing bikes that were designed to be ridden in an aerodynamic posture or ridden in a pack. So they had to have road characteristics, but also have some aerodynamic benefit if we had a solo rider. And so in 2004, we looked at some special tube shapes. In 2005, we launched our first aerodynamic road bike, but it was really catered more towards the triathlon market. It's road racing frame, road racing angles, but it shared some of the tube shapes that we had at the time on our track bicycles and some of the ideas between our triathlon bikes. Then in 2007, we entered the professional cycling peloton at the highest level with the Slipstream organization. At that time, we started looking at the bikes we were manufacturing and what their requirements was. That was a team full of GC and time trialists, specialists off the front. And so we looked at developing ways to incorporate some of the aerodynamic shapes from our time trial and triathlon bikes into a carbon machine. So that bike was debuted in the 2008 Tour de France, and that's where the AR moniker came from. So really this bike, the day that bike debuted in 2008 in July, that's when this bike was started. We started looking at what are ways we can do this better? How can we make it lighter? How can we make it faster? And the other thing that shifted in the market is aerodynamics is no longer something that we look at as a subset of the market. Look at wheels today. No one's going about trying to make a lighter wheel that's a shallower cross section. Everyone's going, how do we get deeper? How do we get more aerodynamic? How do we make a bike that still handles great at a rim depth of 65, 75 millimeters? And so we're looking at the same thing. The new AR doesn't represent a new bike that sets a new benchmark for aerodynamics. The new AR is a new road bike. It's not a specialty bike. It's very light, it's very stiff, it's very comfortable, incredibly efficient drivetrain rigidity. Also a huge advance and a huge step forward in terms of aerodynamics. We'll have a complete white paper that we're developing now with the AR. When we develop the frame shapes, we'll start off with previous designs, previous generations, some competitors' designs that we feel have valid shapes and valid concepts, and we start studying those things in the wind tunnel. Then we'll come about some of our own studies. We'll go in the wind tunnel with maybe 4 or 5 different down tube shapes, for example. And we'll test the down tube by itself. We'll test the interaction of that down tube with the front wheel in front of it. We'll test the interaction of the down tube with cranks and spinning legs behind it. And we'll come up with tube shapes that we feel are going to have the best performance and across a wide yaw range and across a wide performance spectrum. The next step in all of that is kind of selecting each of the individual tubes, go from down tube to C tube and so forth. So we'll come up with, we have a rapid prototyping machine where we can literally print out a frame in plastic and go and test it. So we'll print out 5, 6, 7 different versions that all have different interactions and different characteristics. Ideas, a way of isolating the airflow or maybe integrating the airflow depending on the area. So we already have the benchmark set by our previous generation bikes and some of our competitors, and we do that as a development tool. So we have reams of data. Then when the engineers are finished and they've executed the finished product, they give those reams of data to our marketing department and say, here's where we started with our competitors and here's where we've ended up. And so they'll come up with these claims of, well, that means if you rode our previous generation or if you rode our previous, one of our competitors' bikes in a 100-kilometer race and then rode the AR and spent the entire time off the front, you'd arrive 2 minutes and 28 seconds earlier. So I don't want to misquote their data or misquote their claims because I haven't studied every nut and bolt of the marketing materials, but that's essentially where those things come from. And we see the same kind of claims made elsewhere also. So the key point to remember for us is that we didn't just take the previous generation AR and make a more aerodynamic machine. The bike had always tested very, very well. We've had a bunch of competitor tests. Now the magazine and consumer review sites have gotten to the point where they're taking our bike and bikes from other manufacturers into the wind tunnel themselves. Let's see for ourselves if these claims are valid. And even though the AR, the previous generation, was designed in 2007, in 2013 it still had excellent aerodynamic performance against our competitors. But as materials have advanced, molding and manufacturing techniques have advanced, that bike has fallen behind a little bit in terms of weight and in terms of stiffness. So one of the things we wanted to do was really improve those two characteristics, bring the weight and stiffness to the same level that we have on our Pro Tour bikes, on our F-Series bikes. That the single most focal point on the F-Series bikes is stiffness to weight. So we wanted to rival those things.